Hi there, it's Ron Gula with another episode of the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show. Today I get to interview my friend Rick Gordon. Rick, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for driving from the western half of DC to the eastern half of DC.
You bet. No problem.
That's awesome. So we first met, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but you were running Mach 37.
Right.
And, Cindy and I were leaving Tenable Network Security, and we got to know each other. We really were talking about bringing an incubator to Maryland.
That's right.
And so that's when we first met. But how did you end up running Mach 37?
So it's not a terribly long story. I'd just left a position that I had at Looking Glass and had an idea for a new startup. And went to the Center for Innovative Technology in Northern Virginia, which is, I think, the most prolific seed investor, in Northern Virginia. And I went and pitched to Pete Jobsey for about an hour, and he listened politely. And then at the end of my pitch, he said, "Well, Rick, that's a really interesting idea. If you decide that that's what you wanted to do, we'd probably fund it. But let me tell you what we really wanted you to do for us." And then he gave me the idea. It was really Pete Jobsey's idea to start Mach 37. He was working on getting a few years of investment capital out of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I think they were getting close to that. And it was one of those things where it was a really great opportunity. And some of us are, I don't know how you are, but I'm probably a better coach than I am an athlete anyway. And so to have the opportunity to actually help a lot of other entrepreneurs in many cases, their first journey, it was just one I didn't want to pass up.
So what does Mach 37 stand for?
It's escape velocity.
Or what? The Earth?
The Earth.
That's good. There we go. Very good. Very good.
That's right.
No, it's good stuff. Max Q, all that kind of good stuff. So that's awesome. And then, the other thing I learned doing this is that, the state of Virginia is really the Commonwealth. And anybody who deals with Mach 37, they all know CIS and they all know that it's Commonwealth.
So that's Virginia.
That's right. Awesome. Now, how did you end up? And we're going to talk about Mach 37 a good bit and entrepreneurship, and of course what you're doing today with the MITRE Corporation. But before you went to Mach 37, you went Naval Academy.
I did. Right.
You were a CEO of a company. So what's your background like there?
So started out in the military, as you said, in the Naval Academy. Spent a little time as a submariner. Left after I fulfilled my commitment, went to business school, spent a little time on Wall Street, fell in love with the entrepreneurs, not so much being an investment banker. Decided that, after a little over a year of being an investment banker to do my first startup, did my first startup in security. Back in 1999.
Which was an encryption company.
It was an email encryption company called Tavares. It eventually sold 17 years later. So it was my 17-year-old startup. I didn't stay with the company that long. I left after the end of 3 years and went and joined a couple of friends to start another company called the Civitas Group. Most of those folks were White House folks. Got probably as close to government as I really wanted to get.
Again, right? Yeah, right. After serving in the Navy, right? Everybody has the desire to give back after a while.
For sure.
It's good. What were some of when you were in the Navy, you went to the Naval Academy, they teach leadership, they teach military tactics. How much of that transitions to business? And then how much of that transfers to entrepreneurship?
So it's funny. I never thought about the military tactics part, but certainly the leadership piece of it. That's one of the things I think that, particularly as a junior officer in the submarine force, you're, responsible for the safe operation of a nuclear reactor underway, and 140 sailors sort of are depending on you not to really mess it up. That's a lot of responsibility for a 22, 23-year-old, man. And so that part was, a great lesson. And it's funny as I got into a position on Wall Street and I got in, decided to go the entrepreneurial route and when people are sort of questioning, well, why aren't you a little bit nervous, or aren't you worried about the stress? And I'm just sort of laughing because really no one dies in entrepreneurship, and the stakes in the military are certainly a lot higher, and the people that are depending on you for really a lot more. And so in I think that regard, it really did prepare me for, I think, the rigors of an entrepreneurial journey. I think you never sort of lose confidence in your ability to sort of execute the mission.
That's excellent. So after Mach 37, you've been working on a lot of different things, including Alpha Tech, which is another thing that helps entrepreneurs, another association. We'll talk about that. And you're an investor. Like when you think of your time at Mach 37 and like what you do now, I mean, how many companies have you invested in? Do you own at least a stock, or they owe you money back? Right?
So it's funny. I tried to count this up. I don't know, probably close to 50.
Yeah.
Probably, 60 to 70 transactions, something like that.
And it's funny. I try a lot of times to describe what we do as investors. Mm-hmm. Those seed investors, you don't own stock, you own a loan. You're really lending them money with the right safe note, whatever. And it's like, that's Sopranos. At some time it goes from Sopranos to Wall Street, where you actually do own stock and whatnot. So let's talk about Mach 37. So Mach 37, in my opinion, had a lot of impact on this Maryland DMV, the Maryland, whatever, the VMV, the DDI. The people from Virginia tend to put a V first. The DMV, I guess we'll go with that. But anyway, I thought it was such a good thing that you guys had. You founded in this, early, was it mid 2000s? When was Mach 37 started?
Oh, no, it's 2013.
2013.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the beginning of 2013, maybe middle of 2013, we started then.
And I thought that was really good because it was kind of when cyber was really hitting its stride. Now you did more than cyber, you did IT and data, and that, but it was really a cyber security type of thing.
Almost.
What was getting started out like?
So, wow, that was interesting. It was slow. I think it was really slow to begin with. Particularly, as you know, the seed investor environment in 2013 in this region was really, really difficult. Wasn't an abundance of it. I think other regions had seen in sort of the .com boom and then bust, maybe a resurgence of innovation, venture capital. I think the Northern Virginia region, or the DMV, really didn't. I think you saw a lot of the tech founders went and invested in other things, and there weren't as many sort of institutional funds that we started to see emerge like existed during the bubble.
Yeah, even though this region has got Greenspring and NEA and basically the people who invented venture capital.
It was funny. I did some a quick analysis, and you would have thought, Harry Weller was terrific at NEA, and he really was a terrific leader in the venture community. They were really active in other places, and they still are really active in other places. At the time, let's say 2015, I did a quick analysis, and my guess is that the most prolific investor was in our region was really Bessemer, and really it was the folks from Bessemer that were out of the West Coast. So it didn't make a lot of sense, right? So that made it tough. That made it tough for a lot of entrepreneurs that really needed that critical seed funding early, and then as they started to demonstrate product market fit to get the capital they needed to attract the kind of talent they needed to get those innovations to market.
So what does that mean? You got two founders, right? Right. Maybe a husband and wife team, two friends from college, whatever. They've got a thing. They protect Android phones from ransomware, and they got a demo and they can show you. What happens next?
This is really normally what we'll do is ask them questions about who have they talked to. Always start with what problem you're trying to solve. What problem you're trying to solve. Who has that problem? How many of them are there? Is there anybody else solving the problem? And one of the things I like to say about Mach 37 or any accelerator is what we're trying to do is answer the question, or at least get a statistically relevant sample of input to say, I have that problem you're trying to solve. I like your approach. I don't see anybody else doing it that way. And if I'm willing to pay you X for that thing. And if those numbers look good, then we think you've got sort of an indication of a good business opportunity. It's probably one that I would have been willing to fund.
And how often at that point do you look at the founding team and go, yeah, that guy there, I'm not too sure about him. I'm not so sure I can invest in that. Or maybe that guy's not that polished, but maybe I can give some coaching, give some advice, see if they learn.
So it's funny, right before One Black Cat, it's probably 2015, I think I wrote this blog that got picked up. I typically like two founder teams. Will continue to be overly weighted toward technical founders have deep domain expertise in a thing, that have innovated in in a way that really is could be profound to the industry. I almost always want a second founder that has a complementary set of skills, maybe the softer set of skills, maybe somewhat technical founders don't typically or aren't maybe traditionally more extroverted and maybe not as charismatic, and having that sort of that a complementary bookend of an individual that has the ability to tell a story and inspire individuals not only to come work with you to row the boat, if you will, in the same direction, but also investors to give you the capital that you need. When you can get those two kinds of ingredients, that's a much better investment opportunity. Now, sometimes at Mach 37, or maybe many times, we didn't have that luxury where we didn't have those two founders, and in those cases, we had to have the one technical founder that had the deep domain expertise and was solving a problem that was difficult.
And a lot of people don't realize this, but when you're in the incubation or the acceleration, it's very much akin to the seed capital, where you might be acting as an advisor, a mentor,
sure,
but you also might be a kingmaker. Trying to do the introductions, or a queen maker, perhaps, right?
Sure.
Where we're trying to make the right matches. And I'm always amazed when people come to us and they're like, "Hey, can you introduce us to all the venture capital people?" We're like, "No, I already know half of these people don't want to invest in you because they actually have products in your space already, right? But these other half, maybe not." How often were you playing the market and trying to do matchmaker versus just trying to give good direct advice?
So, at that stage, almost always trying to play matchmaker. I think, there's a lot of self-selection involved in accelerator models, right? There's a not inconsequential amount of equity that accelerators typically take. In Mach 37, we took 8%, right? And we earned it. And we earned it by, building those relationships, facilitating the relationships with either early adopter customers or potential partners, or, in many cases, sources of funding. In fact, I think we catalyzed quite a bit of angel capital in the region when I was there. And so, those were things that I don't know if I would call it king or queen making, but I would say it's, I was really actively building,
just giving good advice.
They needed access to these to individuals, and they needed credibility. They needed someone to lend credibility to them when they had a really good idea, just not a track record yet.
Now, when you think about the region, and we talk about angels versus seed investors versus institutions, we got there's some people, like I kind of started out doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of people who've done that, and then they kind of move up and like, hey, I can kind of do this full time.
Yeah.
But then you've got these formal funds where people are like raising, money from maybe even outside of the country and trying to invest in cyber talent in the DC region. So what do you think of that whole ecosystem in this DC region here? It's
been certainly it's different than what you see in Boston or Palo Alto. I do think that the angel investors, or I would just say maybe seed syndicates, are really filling in a critical gap that exists. There isn't a ton of seed capital here. I think what you'll find is there's a ton of seed capital on the West Coast and in Boston, just way more available. I think PitchBook would support that, assertion. But here's what I would say, at least in cybersecurity, it's knowledgeable here. I think, over the last 10 years, I think folks like you have become really prolific in investing, and Justin Label and Michael Sutton are all, and our colleagues at Blue Ventures, they're all sort of, really stepping up and filling a gap. And the truth is, they're really learning how to do this well because they're getting, more at bats.
It's interesting to compare the DC region to Silicon Valley because, Silicon Valley, you've got a lot of people who are like employee, 2000 at Apple, and they're millionaires and they're doing the seed investing thing. We don't have that ecosystem here in Virginia and Maryland and DC. And it's interesting. So we are trying to get the people who are doing the repeat exits to give back and do that. But a lot of times this means people got to get money from outside of the state, and some of these people leave. What do you think that does to the ecosystem?
I mean, it guts it. I mean, it really guts it. I think we've seen it. We both have friends that have done that have decided to leave the state to go raise capital on the West Coast, and it's a little more prolific. I think they end up. I mean, Bob Ackerman says it, really well when when Steve talks about Data Tribe, look, the intellectual capital's here. I mean, the smartest cyber defenders and offenders in the world are here, in this region. And so, it's rich here. But, the expectation is that, you have to go somewhere else to get the capital. And that's, it's getting better. It's gotten a lot better since 2013. But I think it's, comparatively, we still have a long way to go.
So let's talk about a typical journey for a company going through an accelerator. And do you call Mach 37 an accelerator? What do you think? Because sometimes
an accelerator.
It's an accelerator, but then like Data Tribe says we're a sort of studio, which is interesting. And I think for people on the outside, they're like, what are you talking about, right? So what's the typical journey for company XYZ who goes through Mach 37?
So Mach 37 was really about teaching individuals how to build a business around a technical innovation that they had. So it isn't just building a product that solves a problem, right? Usually we were investing in entrepreneurs or technical founders that had a thing that solved a problem that we thought was important. What they lacked was an understanding of how do you, demonstrate product market fit? Once you demonstrate product market fit, what does the organization need to look like in order to market and sell that particular product into the environment? What kinds of people do I need to hire? Where do I find them? And how do I mobilize capital? And how do I tell a story that would resonate with an early stage investor that's told in a way that they want to hear it. And all of that is really unfamiliar territory for most first-time founders, especially technical founders. And so we taught them how to do that. And we sort of walked them through the journey. And so at Mach 37, it was quite a bit. It was an educational program where we really did walk through soup to nuts. Honestly, I built a curriculum based on all the things I wish I had known the first time I did a startup, because it would have been a lot easier had I known those things. And so we really did sort of try to imbue these first-time founders with sort of an understanding of what the journey was going to look like, and then really allow them to tell the story in a way that was compelling. And I think that by 2018, I think our funding rate was around 70%. It was really high. They were really good at getting capital. So that's the people who
graduate. It's a 6-month program.
It's around the 3-month program.
3-month program. Yep. You did four a year.
Yep.
And you did 4 programs a year.
We had 2 programs a year. We took 6 months off and actually worked with the portfolio the other 6 months.
And then of the people who go through the program, 70% were able to raise money.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
That's really high.
Yeah. That's excellent.
Yeah.
That's excellent. So what are some of the things you have to tell the founders that they're just like, well, no, I've always done it this way. What do you mean I have to do it this way?
So one of the first things for founders to learn, particularly technical founders, is you're not building a product. You're building a company, and helping people understand that a company is a group of people that all have different skill sets that allow this group to sell, produce and sell a thing that solves a real problem in the market. And that's often difficult because with technical founders, I think the journey ends when you sort of get to copy zero, and it's oftentimes harder to sell the thing than it is to build it.
I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
And I've built this amazing widget. How come nobody's buying it or using it? Or
it's on
I even sold it to that company and they're not using it the way I intended them to use it. Right.
It's people it's a good product manager will quickly root out why a customer wants to buy a thing. And it's almost never why the founder wanted to build it.
So one of the things I really liked about Mach 37 is you had a demo day where you would invite. I got invited several times, but you would invite like this network of venture capital, the angels, media, and it's an audience for those companies to stand up and give a presentation. Very stressful thing for some people. It's pretty easy to be like, oh yeah, that wasn't that interesting. Like, oh my God, that could crush somebody, right? Yeah. Or holy cow, that's interesting. Could I take your card? And they faint, and it's so that in and of itself is an amazing thing. What were some stories you have from demo days?
My favorites were like befores and afters, right? Some of the, Callahan Slovins and, an entrepreneur that I have in common, right? That we know well. young guy when he came to Mach 37, and was always charismatic, but not the world's best presenter to begin with. He was fantastic at the end. It's a whole cluster of JP Bourget at Security, same. Really not used to public presentation, but by the end, these guys were really seasoned at sort of giving the pitch, and that was rewarding.
And it seems unfair, but there's so much you can learn from somebody to see what happens when the PowerPoint doesn't work, or they're a little too loquacious, right? Or they make a certain comment. You can learn a lot into that. And so you mentioned Kyle Hansloven at Huntress. That's an example of a company that just you got incubated, was able to raise a couple of rounds, and now they just raised not only from the Gulas and ForgePoint, but JMI Equity, which is just phenomenal, right? So they're doing extremely well. What are some other big wins that have come out of Mach 37?
So that one's probably one of the best. Black Kite's doing very well. I don't know if it came out as Norm Shield. Changed their name about, I guess, a year and a half ago. So they're doing incredibly well. Threat Switch out of Charlotte. I don't know if you remember those guys. They're also really fast growth rate at Lumen. Another one, guys at Rob Johnson came out of CrowdStrike, and actually defended against the DNC hack. You probably see him. I think it's on MSNBC quite often. He's a commentator there. So they're also thriving. But those are probably I know I'm forgetting some other good ones.
It's always tough. And you think how many, if you did two quartets a year, it's got to be at least 60, 70 companies that went through the program.
Yeah, right? When I was there, I think it was in the 40s.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, very cool. So I, one thing I want to ask before we move off of Mach 37 is just, when you think about the cyber industry, it's dudes like us, right? White dudes, smart dudes, good looking dudes, whatever you want to call it, right? But dudes all around, right? So what was your thought on minorities, young women, old women, African Americans, just people who are trying to get into the industry?
Yeah, it's an industry we can do better.
Yeah.
And it's, bottom line is we can definitely do better. I mean, it all starts with, better STEM education, right? And inspiring, maybe underrepresented groups to really pursue more technical careers. But honestly, that's going to be a generational thing that we have to change, right? As a nation, right? As industry players, we can make decisions. We get to make decisions to actively pursue, coworkers that are underrepresented populations. I'll tell you, good example. I'm sure we'll talk about MITRE in a little bit, but MITRE's an incredibly inclusive place to work, and there are some amazing talent that just happens to be underrepresented populations. I mean, amazing. And so whatever MITRE's doing really works.
I tend to see that MITRE's kind of mirrors a lot of the government agencies. I tend to see a lot of that, so it's, without getting into the whole, how do we inspire more people to get into this industry? But I look back at Mach 37, there were some good wins. We had Marcus Carey. He did vThreat and now became ThreatCare, which had a good exit. You had a number of female entrepreneurs, which is good. We could always do more.
We could always
do more, which is good. So, when you were done with Mach 37, you went what I considered to a formal venture capital role. So Innova Health. And, I was always thinking every cyber deal that I see that's raising money, I'm going to bring to this healthcare fund because healthcare and cyber go hand in hand, right? And how many deals did we do together? Zero. So what kind of things did you work on at Innova?
So mostly software, although, there were some things that we sort of strayed out of our swim lane. I did one therapy, but generally it was mostly software oriented things. So a lot around AI or machine learning, and imaging, had a couple of really good investments there. Did another one in patient engagement and women's health. Baby Scripts, you might know them. They're a Washington, D.C. based company that's also doing very well. But I typically tried to stick to my knitting, and I knew how to invest in software companies, based on my experience at Mach 37 and in the portfolio that I was managing. And that translated fairly well, although I tell you, there quite a few differences in health tech investing, right? It's a little harder.
is, with cyber security, and I'm trying to say cyber security because I don't think when you say cyber, anybody knows what the heck you're talking about. But anyway, but with cyber security, if I have a widget, I can give you the software. You can pay me for the software. I can put it on the cloud. You can buy a subscription to it. And those are kind of the two ways. Maybe I put it on an appliance, that kind of thing. Or maybe I'm just giving you data. There's so many different modes. With healthcare, though, holy cow, it's a very complex system.
It's incredibly complex.
How did you do like market scopes? What's your total addressable market? Who's your buyer? Who's your buyer personas?
Yep.
Yeah.
So for software, same approach, right? You can do a bottoms up, analysis of the total addressable market. What really gets murky is, pathways to adoption, right? And so with, typical software in cybersecurity, whether it's consumer oriented or whether it's enterprise oriented, you sort of know generally what who the target customer is, how many of them there might be, and then we can go out and do interviews to validate whether or not there's a demand. Do they have the problem you're trying to solve? Do they like your approach, and will they pay X if it solves the problem? In healthcare, that's just the beginning. I mean, so let's assume in normal software you do that and you build the thing and it actually meets the customer's need, and good confidence that there's product market fit. Just pour fuel on the fire, right? We'll put capital into the company. We'll hire more people that know how to get it to market. We'll scale it up. In health, it really is just the beginning, particularly if it's related to a therapy or anything that's FDA regulated. If that's the case, then there's a whole, FDA process, which ultimately can be binary. I mean, it's either, a 1 or a 0. And if it's a 0, you could have spent a lot of money getting it to that point. So that's an added complexity. But then similarly, if in healthcare, everybody sort of expects for insurance to pay for it for many things. If it's not reimbursable, it gets really difficult, for the market to work. And that is an art, understanding reimbursement policy and whether or not an insurance company is willing to pay for it, or how to get the insurance companies to pay for a thing that even if the empirical evidence demonstrates that it does reduce the cost of healthcare, for them and others. It is still really difficult to get through those set of hurdles. And if you think like an investor, those are two really significant, levels of complexity to getting a positive return on investment.
How did you handle the transition? Because many of the incubated companies, two guys in the garage, the stereotype, right? But, an incubated healthcare startup might have $35, even $100 million of government NIH funding,
right.
And we're just about to test it on rats or something right. like that. How did you handle that? And then how do you handle things like, I can do a better password manager, but now you're over here, you're like, I can detect stage 1 leukemia.
Yeah.
And that's real.
It's real.
That's
why I did it. So the short answer to the first question was we didn't. For anything that was that capital intensive, we just didn't. There are individuals that focus on therapies and pharmaceuticals that make those investments, and those are $100 million bets that get made, and so we didn't. We just stayed clear. We did one. We actually did one pharmaceutical investment for a treatment for hyposmia, which is a loss of sense of smell, which very large market. So it took us about 3 times as long as it took us to get any other investments done.
Did you do this before COVID? You did, because that's the thing, right?
Well, the market was still big, but honestly, it was the biggest risk, and we knew this going into the transaction was financing risk. No one was funding those kinds of investments. It was a really big market opportunity, but we also knew that it was going to take more money than we had to put into this investment to get it through the regulatory process so that it could get to the market, and then it had to be marketed. Then COVID.
Yeah.
Right. The company's doing very well.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And good for them. I mean, it's unfortunate for people who lost their sense of smell, but hopefully that they can help them.
Mm-hmm.
What, did you have any parallels in just cybersecurity in general with healthcare? Now you mentioned when to fund a company,
mm-hmm.
it's the FDA still might have to regulate it, mm-hmm. might ban it. And I'm always imagining stuff like, we have honeypots.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe the SEC is going to ban honeypots and deception and stuff like that one day for some reason. What do you think of that?
So I certainly healthcare is certainly more regulated than cybersecurity is. I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm hoping that at least from a regulatory perspective, that the market forces can drive most things forward. I'm not sure that's going to work in every case, right? And so we'll see. We'll see if, from a policy perspective, this administration continues to move forward. The last executive order.
I want two simple regulations.
What's that?
I want SEC to do for Sarbanes-Oxley what they did for cyber. So I want to have a cyber boards on those things. We're not doing that. And the second thing for consumers, I don't think we're going to fix cybersecurity. I just want to know where the data is. I don't want it made in China. I want data stored in China. It's going to have a bigger impact than I think it'll do. So those are two things I want.
Those are good impacts. There's some other things where we continue to think about, like, where market forces really don't seem to be working. We've been thinking a lot about SBOM over the last 6 months and the need for it. And in fact, I'm funding an analysis that we're doing internally now.
Well, we got to say what's SBOM, right?
Sorry.
That's all right.
Security, software bill of materials. So it was essentially when, software is written to really understand, what the component parts are and what the provenance of each of those component parts is, so that we can determine whether or not the Legos that go into building software, because it's all Legos these days, which of those Legos may be suspicious or may have a vulnerability associated with it. And as a software consumer, if you don't have the ability to unpack that to see what's in the ingredients, a lot of people use the Twinkie metaphor. Can't tell what's in it, then you don't know if it's good for you. And so we don't have that today, in anywhere. And one of the things that I'm scratching my head over is, why the market forces aren't working. I mean, it's technically feasible. Now, there are some standards that are emerging that some of my colleagues at MITRE are involved in sort of shaping. But you would have thought that, software assurance has been around for a long time too, right? So this isn't sort of a new thing, but creating the infrastructure and giving the consumers of enterprise software, especially, the ability to sort of unpack what's sitting on their networks, seems perfectly reasonable to me. And why the market forces aren't working is really an enigma that I'm investing time and money to figure out.
Yeah, so we can talk about that a little bit. So these microphones here that we're recording, I gotta believe there's software in them somewhere, right? I'm hoping it's just some capacitor thing that's modulating with the tone of my voice. But maybe there's a USB on the other hand and other end of this, and maybe it's being sent everything we're saying to Russia or China or who knows. Would SBOM let me, as a consumer, when I'm in the store buying microphones, hey, that microphone's a microphone versus that microphone is a complex piece of software that I don't want to take responsibility for?
That's a really good question.
I rehearsed it.
So,
because I have a feeling if you said this software causes cancer, right?
Wouldn't it be great if we could do that?
It's still going to fly off the shelves because I need my Salesforce. I need my Microsoft. I mean, it's a hard problem.
And so that might be the reason that the market forces aren't really working. And so when that happens, and there's a systemic issue, what is the role of government? What is the role of policy? And sort of stimulating that, the market there. I don't pretend to know the answer.
Yeah. Or look at Windows 11. So we're on Windows 10 right now, and Intel and AMD, they had a hardware vulnerability where you could do the side look. This is the meltdown vulnerability, right? And the fix to it requires a CPU refresh.
Yeah.
So now it's not only just, the software that goes into Microsoft 10 or 11.
Yeah.
It's, you got to have the hardware that kind of goes with it. It's getting more interesting.
Yeah.
Plus they're getting into that trusted, what's TPM stand for? Trusted process management, process modules. The chips on the board dictate what software boots and that kind of stuff.
That's really interesting. But you've got to figure it, eventually it gets down to the metal anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's all about the penniums.
That's
right. So we mentioned MITRE a couple times. Mm-hmm. So you joined MITRE. What is MITRE? Besides when I was growing up, it was the sponsor for Sesame Street, right? So
really?
Yeah. Brought to you by the MITRE Corporation.
I had no idea.
Oh yeah. Every time Big Bird walked away or the electric company, they did a lot of that kind of stuff.
I'm going to do something with that.
Yeah. So what is MITRE?
So MITRE's a nonprofit, 501c3, operates multiple federally funded research and development centers, FFRDCs. If you're familiar with that term, that generally for government sponsors almost always always in public, in the public interest, almost always in national security mission spaces.
And they're very involved with standards,
Mm-hmm.
almost to the point of view like NIST. A lot of people think that, NIST invented the yardstick, but MITRE actually invented the yardstick, right?
I don't think so. I doubt that's true.
Not the yardstick, but they started off CVE.
Yeah. So CVE is a really good example of, if I'm not mistaken, in 1999, CVEs was started, that project, and sort of operated on its own, I think, until 2005,
Mm-hmm.
where, NIST, who's a MITRE sponsor, sort of took over the initiative with Common Vulnerability Database.
Yeah.
Which is still, of course, fueled by the CVE. But yeah, there's a good example of a really good idea at MITRE, some innovators that understood that this infrastructure needed to exist, and the government sort of recognized a good idea when they saw it. And
I started, so for the listeners out there, CVE, we would find a vulnerability in Microsoft. Microsoft would call it Microsoft patch 01912, and some exploit vendor would say this is the exploit for Exchange version 6. And pretty soon you lost track of which was which, right? And where was the vulnerability. So they did a really good job bringing that out. And not only that, but getting buy-in. I can still remember the conferences in the late 90s where MITRE would come around and they'd give out the I Speak CVE badges.
Yeah.
And that was always well done. But they moved on from there.
Yeah.
Right?
Done a lot.
Yeah. So they did SCAP, which
did.
I thought was really good.
Yep.
We used that at Tenable, and this was a way. I'm sure you saw this at Mach 37, right? If you're going to ask a computer with a program, are you missing a patch? Are you configured to turn the screensaver off? Are you, prohibiting USBs? A lot of ways you can code that.
That's right.
And, Tenable might say, hey, our way is better and faster and cheaper than Qualys, more accurate. But, MITRE basically said, here's a way to standardize, have everybody do the same check.
The industry needed it, right?
Yeah. And so I thought that was very powerful at a time when organizations were deciding that configuration management and uniformity was the best way to fight, malware and stuff like that. Yeah. But the best thing they've ever done is MITRE ATT&CK, in my opinion.
No, I agree with you.
Yeah. So what's MITRE ATT&CK?
So MITRE ATT&CK is a global repository of techniques and tactics that we've seen adversaries use in the wild. So it's not a lot of special sauce, not a lot of special sauce that comes to, sort of what gets included in attack. It's really everything that's curated comes from publicly produced threat reports. But the brilliance of attack was that it gave us a really sort of structured way of thinking about and talking about, communicating, sharing threat intelligence efficiently. As in the threat intelligence space back in 2011, 2012, it was difficult. I mean, tips weren't really emerging yet. No one really knew what that meant. But what we did know is that we had indicators of compromise that we at the time thought were really important. They're actually pretty brittle, but we thought that it would be useful to be able to share those things. But there was no sort of common language or common way of talking about and thinking about. And sharing that information so that those that were collecting the information could help those that needed it protect their networks. And I think it's another really good thing that MITRE stepped up and did that. I think ecosystem economics really weren't particularly supportive of sharing information. I mean, I think if you really think about it, threat intelligence vendors had every interest in keeping that data as scarce as they possibly could to keep the price very high. And I think what MITRE did was created an opportunity to, enable the more efficient sharing of that, through common infrastructure much more quickly. That, coupled with, I think, some of the work that Rich Struess did around Styx and Taxi when he was at DHS, and of course now he's at MITRE, and colleague of mine, really did sort of change the game dramatically.
So let's break it down.
Yeah.
I'm doing a phishing attack.
Yeah.
And I trick you to clicking on a URL.
Yep.
And you download software from my fake website.
That's right.
And the software is pretty simple, but it sits on your computer for a couple of days and then it wakes up, downloads a hacking toolkit. Describe that like in MITRE ATT&CK.
So each of those stages that you just articulated to me was a different tactic. And so, if you think about the framework as in the form of a matrix, and there are actually multiple matrices depending on the kinds of infrastructure you're talking about. But across at the highest level, there are a set of tactics that are almost immutable. That anytime an adversary is going to attack a network, there are a series of steps that they will typically go through in order to get to ultimately the exfil of whatever the value they want to get. And I think so. What attack does is sort of there are some very specific techniques that you just described in that scenario. Each of those techniques fits in to a technique that rolls up into a tactic that's linear, and it's almost like telling a story that has a plot and an antagonist and a protagonist.
And that scenario I described, you could pick any particular part of that. And if that's a chain of events that, you could interdict. So for example, I said, I tricked you in this case. I'm the storyteller here. I trick you and you click on a link. Well, that's like a browser, thing.
Yep.
And somebody could say, well, we believe that we can mitigate that with outbound web proxy, with Palo Alto, with browser isolation, right?
Yeah.
And the thing I like about this is MITRE ATT&CK, it lets the organization sort of implement the defenses that's up to them.
That's right. Well, for sure. I think what the attack framework does is it gives individuals a sense of if an adversary is targeting me, that adversary is likely to use these techniques or will use these tactics. These tactics will typically consist of these techniques. These techniques can be mitigated by these set of controls. And so as you drill into the framework, we'll enumerate these are the controls that, and there's some other work that the Center for Threat Informed Defense has done as well in that category. But so these are the controls that you would want to employ to mitigate the impact of that technique. Similarly, these are the data sources that you can collect to know when this technique has been employed. And so all of those are, sort of represent the richness of what's in the framework that, and every time we discover, every time there's a new zero day discovered, or there's a new, a new significant hack, and there's a threat intelligence report, we curate it, we pour over it, and we'll update the framework if we need to.
And it's almost like discovering another element, right? You're literally updating that thing. It
is continually being updated.
And I like to talk about this from the point of view that it demystifies the offense. And, a lot of people are like, hey, how do I get into security? When do I know? Well, there's a lot of content out there, but it's not framed accurate. Literally, if you have MITRE ATT&CK, you literally have all the legal moves that you can make on a chessboard, right? And then once you learn those
that's
moves,
the objective.
right? You can then counteract and you can start doing this like threat-informed defense. Yeah. And it's phenomenal. And, I think a lot of people realize it's hard to defend everywhere. We're supposed to defend everywhere. But at least MITRE ATT&CK lets you prioritize. If you know who's coming at you and you know their techniques, you're the Pittsburgh Steelers, you're playing the Ravens next week, and this is what they're going to do. What are we going to do to counter, that?
Totally right.
It's good stuff.
Totally right. I agree with that. The I think there are always going to be table stakes controls that any enterprise is going to have to implement. But I don't know an enterprise, especially we talked about healthcare, that has an unlimited security budget. So they've got to make trade-offs.
So when I was running Tenable, we would get criticized because, we would prioritize a vulnerability. This one's a critical, this one's a high, this one's a medium. And there's always somebody who's usually really smart and very eloquent. So, I was able to break into a company by taking multiple lows and stringing them together. And it's not that we were frustrated. It's like, well, it's a low vulnerability. I can ping a host, I can do something like that. And if MITRE ATT&CK, I think, existed back then, and Tenable's done this now, you can categorize vulnerabilities based on that. You can really have that conversation, have a lot more context to that. What are some other uses for MITRE ATT&CK that you've seen, either, setting security budgets, doing training, doing training SOC people? Like what are you seeing being done out there?
In fact, we're doing a lot of these things, good use cases for the attack framework. We've talked about sort of, prioritizing controls, enumerating sort of table stakes analytics that need to be run that can, give me sort of, tipping and queuing of someone's in my network. Those are, sort of really sort of obvious use cases. We use Attack to do security operations center assessments. So SOC assessments, we'll use the framework to, systematically go through whether a SOC, is mitigating this particular technique that's likely to be used by this particular adversary, and we know this adversary is targeting enterprises of my ilk. So that's a really good.
Sounds like a company I've heard of before. Maybe Scythe. Are you using those guys at all?
So we have good relationship, and Bryson, of course, has a great relationship with Adam Pennington and the rest of the team.
Yeah, we're big fans of that. So that the fact that MITRE gives you that periodic table, you can now have this like engineering approach of, is your $500 million security budget working? Is your training, your sensors? People don't realize it's like airplanes don't fly just by magic, right? There's sensors and communication and standards. And networks are just as complex. And unless you test them end to end, you're not going to find it.
And test them continually too. Yeah. That's the other issue, is that there's so many. The exogenous environment is continually changing. What we know about the adversary and the techniques that they use continually changes. Similarly, our internal environments are changing. You put new software in your network. That's going to change the profile. Company gets bigger, hits the Fortune 500. It's a bigger target.
Have you done anything personally because of MITRE Attack? Like, have you only used walled garden things, like, Apple products, for example, or you just run Microsoft, which is just reducing your attack surface?
So I've been an Apple. That's a really good example. But I've been an Apple aficionado for a decade, right? And for that reason, just to keep my attack surface lower.
And then MITRE Attack expanded, right? I think we have cloud now. Is it MITRE ICS?
There are
Attack?
many
what are the right acronyms?
There's so many derivatives, and a lot of the work that Adam and his team on the Attack team are doing are, they've done Attack for ICS, Attack for cloud. Of course, there are the variants of Attack for that are associated with certain operating systems, and so those are important. Even within cloud, there are subvariants. I know. And containers that recently came out. Those are all, and they continue to develop new matrices for different. We'll just say different types of infrastructure. I think that'll be important. And I'll also say that Rich Struess and his team at the Center for Threat Informed Defense at MITRE continues to develop these derivative capabilities that aren't necessarily separate matrices, but what they are is maybe compendiums like mapping CVEs to Attack, mapping 802.11, 853 to Attack.
What about like NIST cybersecurity framework and PCI? And what other kind of acronyms can I throw at the audience? So these are usually standards for defense, right? Do you have the right policies in place? Right? How do you map sort of I always talk about MITRE Attack is all about the offense. What can the offense do? And then the defense is your NIST cybersecurity framework, your payment card industry. And a lot of those people, like if you talk to the SANS critical controls people, so they're like, we wrote this because we did incident response and pen testing, so they kind of had that same journey, but you're talking about it from offensive capabilities versus defense.
That's right. That's not a new notion, offense informed defense, right? I think, probably 2008, I think people started to realize that was going to be really important. And some of the best cyber defenders really did come from the offensive side, Kyle Hansloven, of course, being one of them. So I think, I've just lost my train of thought. Cyber offense and defense.
Yep.
I think Attack really does provide that sort of that maybe some of the missing gap. So if you're going to make decisions based on risk, if you're, a CISO or a cyber defender and you have, limited resources and you've got to decide which of these bets to make in order to defend my network, it'd be good to know what the probability of an event occurring or the probability that particular actor that has that particular capability that is useful against the vulnerability that I currently have open. It'd be good to know what that probability is.
And without the standards, you can't automate it. You can't graph it. You can't use your computer to solve that because these networks are so complex.
That's right.
We need that. So that's awesome. Do you ever think you're going to see MITRE Attack dropped in a hacker movie, like a War Games reboot?
Oh, let's hope.
Yeah.
Let's hope.
Yeah. What would the scene look like?
So I'm sure it'll be Adam Pennington at the console for sure. But it's that would be awesome, right? If and it is, it's really linear and it's incredibly logical. And if you can think about, by the way, the other use case is using attack for threat hunting, right? And so, understanding, if you get an indicator of compromise is typically for, used for a particular thing, you can walk forward and backwards and really sort of start to piece the story together. Now, it's not, it's not deterministic, right? It's hard to know. There are many variables or many pathways that an attacker can take, some of which may not be included in the framework because we haven't seen it before. Right. But what it can do is give you a really good roadmap and a good set of, guesses about what the next most obvious thing to look for should be.
Have you, with MITRE ATT&CK or just working with the industry, have you ever encountered people who have been informed about cyber through Hollywood? And you've had to uninform them,
Oh, so uninformed.
Yes.
I haven't had that experience yet. So it's funny. I'm sure there's a lot of. I used to do that for submarine movies. Seemed to be a lot of those in the 80s. I was a former submariner, right? In cyber, haven't seen a lot of that. I thought you were going to ask the question about inspired by the movies, and my favorite story is Karen Elizari's story, where she. Angelina Jolie and Hackers is apparently the inspiration for it. At least that's what Karen says. And she's, one of my favorite all time, analysts, right? She's really good.
That's phenomenal. So if there was an 80s or 90s hacker movie
Hackers.
that you wanted to get reboot, would you reboot Hackers?
Oh, totally.
Yeah,
totally. That was a good one. So, and it's certainly timely now, right? That would be a good one. Maybe Sneakers.
I could see Robert Redford still today, he delivering, instead of this reports we broke in, it's like, and here's where you're not compliant with the payment card industry. And here's like the 32 different MITRE ATT&CK things that the Iranian cyber group is going to come after you with, that sort of thing. Yeah. And the general public still wouldn't know what we're talking about, but it's, it's fun stuff. Yeah. What's the most egregious sort of hacking cybersecurity misnomer you've seen either in books or TV or movies?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
Is it the speed? Let me just hack into that. Right. I'm in. Right.
You know what it is? It's typically it's the graphical user interfaces that are being sort of, and thank God, because most of the public would have no idea what's going on. Right. But it's the GUIs. Boy, if only they were that good.
Yeah. Or like in the Fast and Furious movies, they're given Cypher's character, right? Like this is a keyboard from the late 90s. Yeah. You can't use this to hack into other all right.
And how about the GUI for when I'm actually cracking? It's always one digit at a time, and you can see that I'm running through these multiple digits, right? Right.
Oh yeah, that's crazy. So what do you think? Could we do anything to get like a Top Gun for cybersecurity that would inspire people to kind of want to get into this business?
Yeah, I mean, I think. So I don't know. It's funny. I haven't spent a lot of time in Hollywood. Or I'm not sure what's involved in getting a movie produced.
Money.
So then, yes, there's plenty of money. Now, as you know, there's plenty of money in cyber.
You're ex-Navy, you're in the submarines. Yeah. Top Gun was a recruiting thing. I mean, there was definitely a lot of cooperation with that. So what, when I think about Cyber Command, when I think about CISA getting funding, when I think about all these different, big things we could be doing.
It's a great idea.
We got to have more involvement, and people like Peter Singer, they've done things before COVID where they were going out and trying to get folks who are writing about, or at least producing stuff in Hollywood, to actually, be accurate, meet people who were real SOC operators.
That's funny. In Peter Singer's book, I think there are a million footnotes, right? Everything is sort of footnoted to, with, some level of accuracy. I'm a big fan of Ghost Fleet, by the way.
Yeah. Ghost Fleet's great. 2034.
I've run it.
I like it. Yeah. I thought people are like, what do you like? And I'm like, look, I love soda, Coke. I like a better Coke. I'll take a Pepsi though. But I thought Ghost Fleet was a little bit more Tom Clancy believable, which is, again, we're talking about fiction here.
No, it's so reminded me of Red Storm Rising. Yeah. Just really, reminiscent of that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things I was kind of like, I wish I'd love to see a sequel to Ghost Fleet, because I don't want to ruin it for people, but it just kind of ends.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't think the war's over, so we'll see. I thought 2034 was a good read. A lot of people who are in the cyber bourgeoisie have read that.
Love that.
And it's there. But it's so hard right now. We call it the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show because, I mean, just this year we had COVID. COVID impacted cybersecurity. Who would have thought an epidemic would have affected?
Right.
We had directed energy weapons being used against people.
Right.
Not in space, like on land, like hitting people's ears and stuff like that.
Crazy, right?
We had the Colonial Pipeline get shut down. I mean, this is just crazy types of things. And it's going to get, as we get more with space and more with, the rapid development and stuff, we're going to see a lot of crazy.
It's funny. Crazy SolarWinds was big. The pipeline, though, I think really hit Main Street. I think Main Street started to recognize. I mean, we all felt it, right? I mean, in fact, personal experience, we had a vacation we had to drive to, and we were up to the last minute, biting our nails.
Oh yeah.
Not sure we were going to be able to get gas.
The quote is 2021, the year cyber went from creating headlines to gas lines, right? So
good headline.
So that's good stuff. So as your role in MITRE, do you get to speak at conferences? Do you get to, how do people find you?
So the best way to find me is, LinkedIn. I think it's easy to find me there. Certainly MITRE is a, good way to reach out to me. But for sure, I'm happy to speak at conferences. I think, particularly the stuff we're doing at MITRE is compelling, as you know. Right. I'm happy to talk about that all day long.
And what about investing? You still look at companies?
Some, not as active, as I was. It's just to be this, right? To be a good investor, you've got to be a good investor, right? And it's difficult, in the role that I'm at MITRE, really to sort of have a day job where I'm, making good bets. And when you're
MITRE's spun out some companies. Are you involved with that at all?
Some, yeah. Usually. I think in most of them, I at least get to opine, on what I think the opportunity looks like. But in general, I'm really focused at MITRE on driving impact and around attack and in different ways. I think we've talked about the Center for Threat Informed Defense, which is really something that Rich Struess and John Baker at MITRE founded, that is absolutely brilliant, leveraging I think the phenomenal impact that attack has already had, but also recognizing that to make things useful, you need to make them more usable, and they're developing derivative capabilities to make the framework a lot more consumable, digestible, if you will.
Well, that's really important, not only for just further adoption of MITRE attack, but I think further professionalization of our industry. So with that, I want to thank you for coming on, sharing your background with the Navy, with Mach 37 and with MITRE attack. Rick Gordon, thank you very much. This is Ron Gula signing off for another episode of the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show. Thank you, Rick, once more time.
Thanks, Ron.